Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the seminar on the post-pandemic Malaysia and its economic challenges. I'm Ariel of the Malaysia program at RSIS. Events in Malaysia are closely covered by our media because of the direct impact and resonance with Singaporeans and as a diversion. But it is important for us to understand Malaysia as a complex polity and respond to developments there with wisdom and in mind. Tanks like RSIS hope to provide value here by presenting political and policy leaders and experts who can connect the dots and provide guidance on the likely trajectories for Malaysia. As Ambassador Ong Kim Yong often tells us, with Malaysia, what you see is not what you get. To help us with this today is Nurul Izzah Anwar. She arrived just before noon and will be catching her flight after this talk. We are very grateful and honored for this. You would have seen her bio, but briefly, she's MP of Permatang Pauh in Penang, serving her third term in Parliament. Her political career began with the formation of Ariel in 1999. She was third-time party VP and co-election director until 2018. She presently serves on Parliament's Public Accounts Committee and is Keadilan's spokesperson for women, family, and community development. This list, however, belies Nurul Izzah's place in Malaysian politics and the public imagination. As a teenager, she became an icon in the dramatic events of 1999-98. Perhaps to the surprise of many, she stayed on to build up the party and became a lawmaker in her own right. Noted for her dogged focus on institutional reform and critical policy issues involving vulnerable groups. A strategic bridge builder, she played a key role in Pakatan Harapan's 2018 victory. She's known for her candid statements, sometimes getting into trouble for it, honesty being a dangerous habit for politicians, after all. Nurul Izzah remains a source of hope and pride for many Malaysians. She will give her remarks. We will then have a discussion and Q&A. We respectfully ask that our audience refrain from typing on your laptop as it is distracting to us. We have pen and paper at the side for those who may need them. This event is recorded and will be made publicly available later. Nurul Izzah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. My appreciation to RSIS organizing this Malaysia program, and special thanks to Ariel, who she's been trying to get me here for some time, and it's really an honor, especially to address such an important subject matter. This theme provides me with the opportunity to weigh in the policy and governance perspectives, which is not exhaustive, but at least to describe the socioeconomic challenges in, dare we say, post-pandemic Malaysia. Now, friends, previously during the last IDSS political outlook, I shared my constituency's COVID-adjusted pilot multidimensional poverty index study. And at the time, we named the women-led households, single-headed households, and children as the main groups most vulnerable and most deprived during the first years of the pandemic. Now today, thanks to the team, the Malaysia program, helping me craft some of the key focus areas. I think I'll continue to utilize the multidimensional lens as we look at Malaysia's post-pandemic recovery, of course, for our engagement and learning together. Now, first, I'll start with the overview of Malaysia's challenges for economic stability and growth. You can see the key macro and micro stats for Malaysia. And of course, notwithstanding the official statistics, we've been very lucky. We've been very successful in terms of deployment of the vaccine program. However, there's of course challenges. You see there, household debt to GDP ratio, even as it fell, only mere 0.6%. We're still higher than countries in the region, higher than Singapore, higher than Indonesia and the Philippines in terms of household debt. And the government, whichever prime minister you're referring to would always be laden with the problem of government subsidies. 77.3 billion ringgit Malaysia, 9% of our GDP, and of course bringing issues and concerns whether we should focus more on targeted subsidies, because who really is enjoying the subsidies that's being given. Labour force, I think we're 24th in the world in front of Indonesia and Singapore. But of course, the issue of underemployment, mismatching of skill sets. I'm an engineer, but I'm in politics. Clearly not exemplary of the rest. But the point is, you have many graduates who are not really working in the field of choice when you were studying. And I put that little bit of food security because I think it's important to understand where Malaysia is. Chickens, manage, like a coffee and safety. But the point is, we rank 39 out of 113 countries, meaning we're somewhere in the middle. And we have 60% of our food import, and we do relatively well in terms of among the countries in Asia Pacific. But it presents an opportunity, ripe opportunity for reform, especially structurally. And if you look at food, making sure you have availability in terms of security, it's available at all times to the most vulnerable as well. Now, my key question before I move on to the second slide is, are the numbers realistic to depict current socioeconomic challenges? Before, our MPI study shows that the reality is far worse on the ground, worse than official data. And the Ministry of Finance own findings show that even as they know who is poor, there are problems with the government's machinery system which experience severe delays in deliverance of aid. So from July to August 2021, it was found that only 19% of households in the bottom 40th percentile of the income spectrum received food basket assistance. 19%. And as many as 40% of SMEs were unaware of the assistance provided by the government. So I would argue that welfare delayed for too long is also welfare denied. And this will result in considerable ramifications for the socioeconomic recovery of vulnerable segments. Second slide. So, unemployment at 3.9%, we really improved from the first date of 4% since the pandemic. And the Malaysian Employers Federation also really addresses the issue that we have a labour shortage across all sectors and of more than 1 million unskilled labour. We do have improvements in terms of labour participation rate, increasing slightly. But again, when you look at the issue of poverty and inequality, I always believe we always want to do better. Talking about challenges in the 21st century, you also want to measure poverty far more eloquently and comprehensively. 52% of Malaysian households are not protected by the EPF or Employers Provident Fund, and females face greater challenges. You talk about the double burden, 57% of female-headed households are not protected. And in terms of the price hike, I can tell you right now, the huge issue in Malaysia. Food and non-alcoholic beverages, 5.2% year-on-year increase in May 2022, which is the highest since October of 2012. And this is another niggling problem of malnourishment. I think it's quite bizarre, but I think perhaps the nutritional content again goes back to the issue of food security. Kelantan, the northern state of Kelantan, which is held by a class, it's under party right now. You have 34% of children there are stunted. And I refer to the Ministry of Health data. Malnourishment is causing stunting amongst children, recorded an increase from 17% in 2015 to 21.8% in 2019. So these are maybe you have to be a bit more careful, I think, for the government, and also to kind of help us in redirecting more investments in healthcare. Now, education. I think this is one of the key things that really affect me. So I feel privileged as a mother of two that my children can at least have accessible and continuous internet access when schools were closed, as many as 35 weeks in Malaysia. So we're talking about a great number of weeks, and 21,316 students, as a result, did not complete their education, dropped out of schools from March 2020 to July 2021. It's funny, when we were going for the by-elections in Malacca, the state by-election, I'll see some of the kids, school-going age, they'll be helping their parents selling nasi lemak, pisang goreng, and I will ask, what's your favorite subject? Which school do you go to? And, 2 out of 3 at that particular visit would tell me he doesn't want to go to school anymore. He's no longer interested. He's staying with his grandma, grandpa. So imagine dropping that 13. I think, it's really heartbreaking because their own social and educational mobility hinges on that experience. There's a learning poverty brief by the World Bank. In July 2021, they found out that 43% of children in Malaysia in late primary age are not proficient in reading, and 8.3 percentage points, and this is 8.3 percentage points higher than the average in East Asia and Pacific region. So it's really concerning. And by October 2019, we found that 30% of children in Malaysia at late primary age, they are not proficient in reading. So this is very instructive because you have to, improve these numbers. And again, it is better than the average for the East Asia and Pacific region, but you see a decline from 2019 to 2021. So I believe that Malaysia has done it before, so we certainly can reorient focus in this direction, but we need to know what needs to be plugged in. So we went from 8.2% better than the East Asian average to 8.3% worse than the East Asian average. So these are things that I believe would affect us in the shorter and medium term, if not immediately. Gender challenges I mentioned earlier, double burden in women, we're paid less usually, and in the informal sector, a lot more women are more involved. And even though at the time Pakatan Harapan government introduced the ISURI scheme for housewives, it was a good start to make sure they at least have something to depend on, but it's not enough. Although SOCSO, our domestic workers scheme, is promoting voluntary contribution, but it's not nearly enough. It's a little bit fragmented, and I'll allude to this data through the Kazana Research Institute report and findings. The last bit is the Tibet innovation. I don't think much respect is given to the skill sets of technical and vocational education. I think, like it or not, if Germany can be built upon, the Tibet skill set, why not countries like Malaysia? And we really need to understand what's our comparative advantage and do more in this field. So the future of the Malaysian higher education will heavily involve vocational and community colleges, in my humble view, and this should become the educational and skill support of Malaysia's SME sector. According to the Malaysia's Department of Statistics, Malaysia adopted SMEs contribute 38.2% to national GDP, 13.6% to export revenue, and employ 48% of our workforce. And it's a sector that will definitely play a major role. Now, the next slide. This is quite important. I felt that this was crucial because when you talk about the long-term and structural changes facing my beloved country, not many politicians think of this. I think we're always somehow held captive by elections when it should really require a few cycles and some degree of continuity to help us measure the efficacy of the chosen policy. So I would say we do lack, and we don't have a cohesive set of complementary reforms to meet our structural deficiencies. I know that Bank Negara Malaysia, Central Bank, has worked hard to come up with a draft of climate-related legislation for companies to adhere to. So it's still in the works, but at least they're moving ahead. But if you talk about even climate change, Baling, Kedah is now for the victim. A family is lost in the flood. And we have yet to come up with our Disaster Preparedness Act. So these are the things that we're looking forward to, not just today, but yesterday, because it's really important to understand and kind of corral the different agencies across state and federal governments to make sure we address the ones in need ASAP. We also have the issue of social policy or social workers profession act. These were acts and laws that were discussed very seriously by the three governments ago. So I think it's important to bring them back. As you talk about a post-pandemic recovery, you know that these things are going to bite us. We do need to depend more on social workers. We need to understand the need to introduce the Elderly Act. So, for me, Parliament should really be prioritized to pass through these laws. The second one, as I mentioned earlier, fragmented social security scheme. There's a report that Khazanah Research Institute published in 2021. The number of schemes in Malaysia have proliferated, but the number or the amount of assistance have been reduced and spread thin. So if you look at by the year 2012, we had 95 federal social assistance programs. It's increased to 137 by 2020, but the amount has actually dropped after a peak of 2012. So I think when you talk about even before accounting for the various new ad hoc schemes in 2020, 2021, so that's the schemes to address the pandemic. But the point is systematically, there's a running trend. And I think it's important to reduce bureaucracies and inefficiencies to make sure that you address and target the recipients. So, you need more political will and state spending to address socioeconomic issues, especially amongst vulnerable groups. And you have the fuel subsidy, which is excluded in the graph and the figure. You can see later. But the point is, yes, we have seen more cash transfers, but overall, as a quantum, is not nearly enough compared to the programs that's been introduced. The next is systemic inequality of opportunity, which is impacting social mobility. The gap between the rich and poor will continue to widen, seen through how much we invest or how much we focus on education and healthcare. I was just speaking to the president just now, and I think it's important to, give credit to the Ministry of Health. But then again, the budget, the Malaysian budget must also reflect the degree of success which sector has kind of achieved. So if we do care about the healthcare of our constituents, of our people, then we certainly need to provide more money expenditure in that regard. And in terms of the gap, that's why I feel the impact on children and youth growing up, you will see a bigger pool of the lost generation. Notwithstanding the apathy people feel towards politicians, that these are the groups that will not have the necessary skill set to move forward. Malaysia has actually had the highest learning loss amongst ASEAN developing nations, and it exceeds losses for all ASEAN members except for Myanmar. This is according to the Asian Development Bank in April 2021. And in 2021, in its study in Malaysia showed that 20% of inner city children, as I mentioned earlier, the boy in Malacca, they have lost interest in schooling. They don't plan to return. And that's why I feel when we talk about investments in human capital, we really need to address this to reduce intergenerational inequality. Last, aging nation. Low retirement and safety net, we became an aging society, 7% age 65 and above in 2020. Age society by 2044, 14% age 65 and above, and a super age society faster than we should. In 2056, 20% of our population is 65 and over. And I think kudos to ETF. And we met with the leadership, our employers provident fund. They have a good program to manage the withdrawals, but only 3% of existing contributors can afford retirement. Only 3%. And by 2040, 14.5% of Malaysian population will consist of those aged 65 and above. So for me, we do need to maybe focus on the implementation of such plans, because Tok Pa, who is the minister and the Prime Minister's department in charge of the economy, did come up with an agenda for an aging nation by 2030, implemented by the Economic Planning Unit. And the issue is, again, to make sure that we reach targets that we set out, despite or in spite of the election results. And I think this three challenges of labor shortages across the skill spectrum is something that we have to look at very seriously, and that's why I look at TVET as one of the key possible solutions. Next. Okay, so these are the review of just some of the existing policies I've taken a pick based on the things that really impact my constituents as well. You know, Ha Jun Chang, the economist, the South Korean economist, commented on Malaysia. And he said, no, Malaysia is not, we do have great plans, but we need to focus more on implementation. We need to focus more on follow through. And I think he's right, because, even some of the grand vision, no matter the Prime Minister, it's important to have that narrative being carried forward by all of Malaysia. But again, what's more important is the civil service, the agencies have to walk the talk. And the recent announcement to increase minimum wage, for example, I think a lot of people, a lot of Malaysian businesses expect some degree of certainty. So while you introduce minimum wage, they do expect perhaps the electricity hike will not be announced. Similarly, with multidimensional poverty, multidimensional measurement of poverty, the World Bank just came up with its latest Malaysian Economic Monitor, and it stated that our current MPI is too low. Using the current threshold, only 3.7% Malaysians are regarded as multidimensionally poor in 2016. When you talk about a more realistic application, would yield 15.3% of the population. And this is to be stated in Rancangan Malaysia ke-12. We stated that we wanted to revise it upwards. But again, I think it has to really be done and discussed openly, have engagements with members of parliament. I will say that under Tok Pa, we have had more data access by the Department of Statistics Malaysia. So we do have some of the figures, demography for our constituents. But at the end of the day, when you talk about delivery of aid, you need to have an integrated approach. As much as you want to of course, provide protect the privacy of the recipients, integration is in sore need for Malaysia. Now, I mentioned that the mismatch thing is quite clear. And what we have been trying to do is actually perhaps the Attorney General's chambers. There's a bottleneck there because a lot of the laws are always dependent on one particular agency. So sometimes the opening of parliament is not necessary to create mayhem. I think the fact that you allow for private members of parliament to come up with their bills and laws will help cajole a long spectrum of introducing institutional reform. So looking at it, it's not necessary to make things difficult for the incumbent. Sometimes you actually make things better for the country. So the way we look at governance has to be far more optimistic and beyond the politics. Cash handouts and subsidies, because like it or not, all subsidies, petrol subsidies, we really have not benefited the ones who are in sore need of it. But again, it's a very controversial subject matter. And I do hope at this parliamentary session we can talk about it in greater detail. Because if you look at, for example, the subsidy on electricity, that covers 70% of households. Meaning, okay, there's some degree of explanation. So the devil is always in the detail. Because if you just assume all subsidies are good, it's problematic. But if you also assume that all subsidies have to be done away with, it's also problematic. And I think a less ideological pursuit of certain things, but looking at evidence, looking at efficacy, looking at impact would be better. Next. Okay, so this is the picture of Professor Fatimah Kari. I wanted to show this because I dragged her out of retirement to perform the come from Johan, so you're going to be next when you come back, to conduct the multidimensional poverty index study. So it's quite important because I'm an opposition member of parliament. So before I dragged a University of Malaya economist, I met Topa because I said, please provide her protection because this is not political. This is an important effort. You want more of us to be led by the evidence. So that's her interviewing the woman, April to May, Siti, if I'm not mistaken, in Permatang Pauh, 2021, at the height of COVID. Why? Because we didn't want to forget the impact of COVID. We didn't want to forget to record so that policymakers in government can make the necessary changes and not return to the previous normal. Now, the picture, I invited Dr. Sri Mustafa to launch the report because, again, I want it to be bipartisan and I want it to be part of government policy. And Alhamdulillah, the government at the time announced, this was what, last year, Jana. They announced 10 areas in Malaysia, across Malaysia, that will also implement a deeper utilization of NBI. But again, it has to change the amount of money and assistance and support that you give. Okay, next. All right, so this is, what are the challenges to and obstacles to policy and governance? Lack of institutional memory. Yeah, Ariel, sometimes when we at the PAC, when we're auditing ministers and civil servants, I get very frustrated because it's very important to follow through with the plan in action. So the level of which a particular ministry and agency has institutional memory will help them to grow and strengthen further in terms of performance and targeted agenda. So it does waste money, in my view, every time the minister changes, because it's as if you're starting from scratch. I mean, we don't need to. We don't need to. And I believe that's a big challenge for us. And of course, you talk about short-term electoral versus longer-term thinking. I've alluded to the importance of private member bills. And also the fact that we do need evidence-based initiatives to lead any government, whether federal or state, forward. I do have a good working relationship. I mentioned here too. One is the All-Party Parliamentary Group Malaysia working on the Sustainable Development Goals. It's headed, number 2, it's headed by a Sarawakian Member of Parliament from GPS, from the ruling party of Sarawak. But it really tried to push forward in targeted constituencies across Malaysia. How do we implement projects that will elevate the constituency to meet the targets of the SDGs? And of course, my favorite, Jabatan Penjara Malaysia. It's funny because I always go to the headquarters across 4 prime ministers. I find myself always going to the Penjara Malaysia. And they're a very committed bunch, actually. They want to implement reforms. They want to make sure that they reduce the number of detained in Malaysian prison, because more than 60% are there due to drug-related crimes, type of crimes, and for them, they're about rehabilitation. They're like, you can't expect us to rehabilitate people behind bars. We don't support us. We don't have to support the society, the communities, the NGOs. So I was sufficiently encouraged by that, and I think there's a reform and making sure they remove 75% eligible prisoners by 2030 as non-violent criminals is something we have to celebrate. But of course, we then have to influence and persuade the minister, because sometimes some of these pockets of change and hope, they don't necessarily take place in the minds of a politician, right? They take place in different pockets that we as politicians have to identify and promote and push further. Okay, next. So I mentioned earlier the key challenges, short-termism versus long-term thinking, apathy. We had up to, how much was this thinking about? 82% voter turnout rate 2018. 82%, most of them also coming from Singapore. But then the number fell. Yeah, by the time we had the state elections in Malacca, we had only 65.85% turnout. And of course, even as they were eligible, we really couldn't bring out that number, especially on the plan voters. So who turned out to vote? It was the incumbent supporters, with the members of UMNO, of Barisan Nasional, and of course that secured the results. So the lack of representation is really recognized by UMNO, and this was also alluded to and admitted to by UMNO's president. And I think their strategy in Malacca is to ensure voter turnout to be less than 65%. So our strategy is to make sure they come out. But again, how do you fight against the apathy and the anger? And I'm working on it. Challenges around access to data. I mentioned here, it's improving, but generally, if you're an academic working in Malaysia, you will face some challenges in accessing the data, and of course, corruption and patronage politics. I think this is something that we have to fight against. The specter of kleptocracy, the specter that if you're corrupt, you will pay, the specter that you will not get away from the crimes you committed. It's important because it's ingrained in the culture. It's ingrained across the society. How do you teach kids in school? Is it okay to lie and get away with it? Or the other way around? So I keep thinking about this. Who are the local heroes they want to look at? Who they want to be kind of? Is it the skin cepat kaya, the next datuk from the nearby kampung? I mean, what kind of values are we actually instilling in the youth today? It's important. So for me, yes, corruption and patronage politics, but it's a stronger psychological meaning to it. Okay, next. So key takeaways, I feel, what are some of the national policy responses? One is cradle to grave social protection program. Just because you're 40 doesn't mean you're automatically happy. Sometimes, it is always going to be, ups and downs. You lose your parents, you're not often at 12, is there protection for children without parents? And then, of course, then you're elderly, but you're left alone. So these are the things that we have to look at. And I think it's really also to rethink on how we do the social welfare, and even as how we look at the women's ministry. The women's ministry should rightly be the frontline ministry. I kept saying with the pandemic, I know defense is important, and I know Shamila and I not just to say, but my point is you also can't belittle and render aside the importance of the health ministry, the women's ministry as key determinants of our success. Upskilling and reskilling. Now, when I was heading the TVET Empowerment Committee back in 2018, we came up after 6 months with a bill on TVET and related industry, because we knew that it's very fragmented in Malaysia. You cannot have an accreditation body placed under another ministry when other ministries also have their own TVET institution. So it has to be one-stop center. It has to be quality control, not fearful of politicians controlling other TVET colleges. So these things I felt was crucial to a commission. I've also passed on to the government again. At least that bit of institutional memory is held by different ministers across the different governments. Okay, of course, to strengthen institutional memory, a lot of pride I have in not just the Kazana Research Institute, even in our EPF, even in our EPU. At one point, EPU was really properly heralded as one of the best agencies. And that's why I feel that we should listen to them. I don't know why we're listening to politicians. Because a lot of institutions, the academics, the studies have looked through in great detail in terms of what needs to be done. And we have commissioned over the past few years studies by BCG, PwC, McKinsey. And the problem is the fact that how do we ensure that there's follow through and it's implemented? So when I came up with the bill for TVET, it was after reading through 3 key studies. There was an Ipsos study, there was a PwC study, and BCG, all commissioned during Najib's time. But I felt, it was important for me to read through. Why? Because the studies were done, assessments were made, and interviews were conducted across all Tibet institutions under the government. So then, what is to be done, and that's how we came about with the Tibet bill. And the last bit is continuing periodical reviews and proactive operational follow-through. Yeah, I think it's important. I believe that the outlook for Malaysia will be positive, but we do need to knock some sense in many of the leaders. And it's important to work together. When Ariel mentioned building bridges, it's not just building bridges kumbawa for the sake of it. I think concretely, when you have a clear-cut agenda, you make sure that you don't tolerate no nonsense. Yeah. But at the same time, you're also clear on the relative degree of commitment brought by the different sides. So there's no bridging or there's no outcome that can come up from empty rhetoric alone. So thank you very much.